Sony's Concord is dead, more like con job. You can't charge $40 for a multiplayer game and not guarantee that there's going to be players. You just can't do that. Not in this climate of free to play, what they call games as a service. I hate the term. I think that multiplayer is in the complete wrong direction these days. It's all about, can you sell a battle pass? They tried to make this game without a battle pass, which I think it's a good faith idea, but even that didn't help them. They're going to make absolutely no money. They're giving refunds for this game, as they should, because you can't charge $40 and nobody shows up for an online only experience. But the saddest thing for me is that Sony has fallen so far from where they used to be during the golden age of multiplayer gaming. We used to have so many banger titles like Resistance, like Warhawk. These are very underrated franchises, especially Warhawk. I don't have any footage to show you, but anyone who ever played that game, very unique game. It can be related to maybe something like Battlefield, but what you could do in that game, especially with the dogfights and airplanes, it was just an incredible experience. You had multiplayer games that had deep progression systems, custom matchmaking, clans, stat tracking, all of these features. And modern multiplayer has been dominated by trends. There's no true identity to this era of multiplayer. First, you had the Fortnite revolution of battle royales in every game. Nobody has any original ideas. They're just copying whatever's trending for 5 minutes. And then you have the hero shooter, which Concord was really trying to be a hero shooter, but it wasn't really even... It's a hero shooter that no one cared about because no one cared about the heroes, and the synergy wasn't quite there the way that it is in something like Overwatch. So it's a game that I liked the gameplay personally. I thought that obviously the developers have some talent, but the game's direction and the philosophy behind it, not enough to set itself apart. But I really think that this is an issue with the entire industry as a whole. Let's look at some stats. The Finals was a very refreshing game. It felt a lot like Battlefield, especially with the emphasis on destruction, but it honestly had better destruction physics than we had seen in any Battlefield game in a long time. And it was an interesting concept for a game. 3v3v3, a small tactical team-based game with a lot of emergent gameplay. It's not just Call of Duty spawn in, camp in a corner, get your kill streaks. But the Finals died off after a few months. Interesting game, good gameplay, actual good design, engineering of that game. It died off. X Defiant had 2 million players a few months ago. Now it's down to a few thousand. You don't hear about the game anymore. No one's making content on it. You've got a lot of niche games. There's nothing wrong with a small player count on a game as long as the people are having fun, but it isn't worth it to keep the servers up when the game is dead on arrival and there's not going to be any money made from the game. They're doing the right thing by refunding, but there's still people on like RPCS3. People on RPCS3 still play a lot of the old games from like the PlayStation 3 era that have been revived from very intelligent programmers that have known how to bring the servers back up for a small audience. And this is something that Sony could do. Sony gave up on so many of their flagship IPs like Little Big Planet. They were supposed to do The Last of Us factions. We don't talk about how much of a failure that was for Sony, that they were supposed to do that for The Last of Us 2, and then they wanted to push that aside and make that a separate, I guess they're probably going to charge money for the multiplayer, and this is kind of the issue with the multiplayer games. The most successful multiplayer games have almost always been bundled with a single player package, and so obviously Call of Duty is popular mostly for the multiplayer, but it's just not a coincidence that it also had a single player component. It's not a coincidence that something like Uncharted multiplayer, which really took off, and the Last of Us factions from the first game, they were all bundled with a single player game. And at first glance, you would think they are just a throwaway mode that nobody really wants to play those, but honestly, those were some of the best multiplayer game modes ever made, and almost all of them. Halo had a campaign and a multiplayer. Gears of War, same thing. So this was back when people were designing games that they really had an interest in making, and they weren't making video games for algorithms or trying to copy some other trend in the space at the time. They were trying to innovate and actually having fun making games. And I don't know if the Concord team had fun making it, but working for 8 years and spending all this money and getting absolutely no interest, that's not fun. I think the same is true with Suicide Squad killed the Justice League. They were making a game that I'm sure they didn't really feel comfortable making. It wasn't even in their DNA to make that type of game. If they had just made another single player Batman game, maybe with some kind of add-on multiplayer, maybe they could have been successful. But, I hate people using that argument for Sony, because Sony is not, they were never known for just doing solo games. They're never known for being the single player movie game maker until The Last of Us came out. And then they started to push during the PS4 era these heavy cutscene story driven games, but during the PS3 era, they were absolutely on the top of their game as far as multiplayer goes. You just had to have been around there to play multiplayer, which was also free to play back in those days. So there's an industry-wide issue with games that are failing after a few months. I call it the Call of Duty one-year cycle, because Call of Duty kind of ruined the industry expectations by pumping out sequels every year. So you have people who would put a lot of time into COD to try to get to the max prestige, and after a year is up, there's just going to be a new release, so you kind of feel left out. It's the fear of missing out if you don't go and buy the new game, which is pretty much a copy and paste formula. So we have an issue with the entire industry of video games is trying to copy one another. Concord really not having an identity of its own. It's kind of like a hybrid between Destiny with some hero shooter elements sprinkled on top that didn't really need to be there. And no one really liked the designs. No one was really into whatever they were trying to sell. I'm not sure that even they know. I'm not trying to be harsh. I actually do think the game had some good gameplay, but nobody wants to actually take a look at that. But even if you do, it's too little too late when so many other games of a similar nature already exist. You could just go play Destiny and have probably a better time on there. I really hope that Sony, in particular, it's just a shame they have so many. In the age of remakes and remasters, they could do such a great job bringing back Resistance, bringing back Warhawk, a lot of Killzone fans. You had games like Mag. You had games like PlayStation Home. You could sell a ton of microtransactions on that. Little Big Planet. And like I said, you had a lot of underrated multiplayer games. Uncharted 2's multiplayer was incredible. A lot of people liked The Last of Us factions. Even Metal Gear Solid 4 had multiplayer. You had a lot of unique games at that time, and we don't have anything like that coming out of the pipeline today. At least not in the AAA space. And then you have publishers that shut down the fan projects like the Modern Warfare 2 remaster team. You have BattleBit Remastered. You have all of these games that were inspired by the big dogs. Like Battlefield fell completely off because I don't know what happened to DICE. I don't know what happened to the creative people working there, or if they're still there and they just have no creative control. But Concord is a failure, but it's not the only failure, because imagine working on all of these other games that I've mentioned that have come out recently. I think Helldivers 2, people still play Helldivers 2. That's like a huge contrast between Helldivers 2 as a Sony live service game and how successful that was both initially and over time. It's not a game that I really enjoy that much, but I can see that it has an identity of its own for sure, and there's still a lot of people playing it, not as many. It's obviously had a drop-off significantly, but people still like that game. But every game in this current climate it loses player bases. Every game in this climate loses players very quickly, and it's just, you can't deny the data. The data's right there. Every game falls off. There's no guarantee of success. Look at Multiverses. Multiverses fell off. Multiverses came out a couple years ago. They took the servers down, then they brought it back, and there was a little initial hype. There's still some people playing it, but I think that's a game that also came and went very quickly. It's the Call of Duty cycle. You know, you have 1 year, maybe, it used to be, for COD, but these new IPs, they don't last more than a few months. So the fact that Concord lasted maybe like a week, that's obviously not good. It's a terrible look for Sony. I do feel bad for the developers because they have some talent, but you have poor management decisions, and I actually blame the management more than anything. So people are going to take the wrong lessons from Concord. They're going to say it's all about the DEI and the propaganda. I understand that has something to do with it because, again, people did not like the atmosphere. They didn't get any good vibes from this game, and I can see why. I'm not saying that the game was very interesting or very attractive from the way it looked visually, but I kind of just laughed it off. I kind of focused on the gameplay because I actually do want a good multiplayer game to play from Sony because I grew up playing their games. So for me, it's even more disappointing. I don't know how they could have forgotten how to make a good multiplayer game given their track record, but here we are. The real takeaway that I hope everyone actually acknowledges is that multiplayer games as a whole are in a hole. Multiplayer games are in trouble. And they do not design games for a long-term progression system. Every game wants to shovel a battle pass in and make you grind for skins or pay money for skins, and there's no real incentive to play a lot of these games. Then you have the skill-based matchmaking issue, which plagues a lot of games. It isn't something that bothers me particularly, although when I did play X-Defiant, I noticed that the game was extremely sweaty and just honestly, it was not a fun game to play with some of the mechanics in that game. If I wanted to play Tag Get Ready, I would go back to Call of Duty, so you have a lot of problems, a lack of identity, a lack of earnest development. All right, people are making these games to fill quotas, to match what the algorithm says they should do. There's not a whole lot of heartfelt game design in the AAA space anymore, at least not in the multiplayer games. And even when there is, then, well, people just come and go because there's always some other trend that they want to chase, you know. So I don't think Concord is the worst failure. I think it's a big miss for Sony, and I think it was a poor idea because you already had Destiny. Why did you need to have your little hero shooter on top of that? Why not bring back the games that only Sony can make, like the Resistance series, which was so unique. Warhawk, like I said, very unique game, very underrated game. I think these games in this space would attract so much attention because they were really about good game design and a good progression system, which is what you must have in a multiplayer game. You must have stat tracking. You must have clans. You must have custom game lobbies for the community. You have to have a communal atmosphere. And people that were looking forward to Concord, it was not really a game designed for anyone in particular, and that's the problem. There was nothing truly unique about it. Maybe Sony should stick to single-player games because you seem to have a better chance at hitting the bullseye on a target audience for something like Astrobot than you do for Concord. Apparently a game made for no one. But this is an issue, part of a symptom of a larger problem, and we have to address that as the gaming community because it's a shame that all these games keep failing, and also that these companies, they don't handle the good game designers, the games that make good games that sell. They don't get the attention they deserve. So things have to change. I've already kind of given up on multiplayer, but we have to know what the signs are next time. And you honestly can't predict some of these things. You can kind of predict Concord was going to fail because it looks so generic. It played like an actual good game, but everything else about it was misguided. But I really don't know. All I can say is you have so many dormant IPs that if you're going to be remaking games, consider making those games or being inspired by those games. Do something that actually feels right instead of following the trends and the algorithms.